Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Oxford Martin School. My name is Charles Godfray. I'm the director. And it's an enormous pleasure to welcome a very old friend of mine who's speaking this evening, Ian Boyd. Ian is a marine scientist by background, works at St Andrews. He was head of the sea mammal research unit there. And from 2012 to 2019, he was chief scientist at Defra, where he is responsible for a huge variety of different topics and political hot potatoes. And Ian retired from that position in 2019, is doing a load of things at the moment, including being co-chair with the Scottish First Minister of the Scottish Environment Council. And so Ian has recently published an absolutely fascinating book called Science and Politics, and that's going to be the subject of what Ian's going to talk about this evening, and then have a conversation. And what we're going to do is Ian's going to speak for about 10 minutes, and then me and my co-chair, Dame Helen Ghosh, will have a conversation with him. Helen is head of Balliol, has also been permanent secretary at Defra, although not overlapping with Ian. And then after that went on to be head of the National Trust. And so we'll have a brief conversation, and then we have a very distinguished audience of people in the front row who have had many links with Ian over the time. So initially we're going to have a conversation with some of these people to invite them to ask questions, and then from that we'll go on to take questions from the floor. And we're going to finish at 6:15. I know on some of the publicity it said 6 o'clock. If you have to leave at 6, then obviously go. But we will go to 6:15. And after that, there will be an opportunity to meet and talk to Ian, and I think buy books with a glass of wine just outside. So with no more ado, Ian.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much indeed, Charles. It's a tremendous honour to have been invited to do this, and actually it reminds me slightly of some of my earlier days as a researcher in Cambridge. I have to mention Cambridge with this audience, but when I used to get an occasional invite to do a tea talk at the Department of Zoology, and of course that was a double-edged sword, in that it was an honour to be invited to go and speak to the academics there. At the same time, I knew I was going to get a tough time. And with the audience I have here, and there are many friends and colleagues, and esteemed friends and colleagues, who actually probably know more about this subject than I do. It's pretty daunting. So I'm really hoping that as a result of what I have to say this evening and the discussion, I can provoke debate. And actually, that at the end of the day was part of the reason for writing this book, was really to try to surface a lot of the issues that I had experienced as a chief scientific advisor, and trying to get them into a debating chamber actually quite like this. So I'm really hoping that we can have a good discussion this evening. And thank you very much to all of you for coming along. I think many of you in the audience could have written a book like this, but there's a question as to why you haven't. And I think I have to reflect on the fact that there have been many, many people who have had my kind of experiences as CSAs, and actually the only book that I could find that has been written about that experience goes back to Solly Zuckerman, I think in 1982. So there are probably some reasons why there hasn't been more reflection from those cohorts that have gone through. Some may say it's a stupid thing to try to do, and maybe I'm the stupid one in the room. But let's see, and it will be really good to get your reflections even on that and be blunt about it. So fundamentally, I had, I think, 3 reasons for wanting to write a book like this, quite apart from wanting to be a bit provocative. I didn't think, as I said, that there was an existing book on this. And I kind of had to reflect on the fact, back to 2012 when I became a CSA. There really wasn't anything that told me what it was like, and I had to learn very quickly myself. And I hope that the colleagues in the room who have been CSAs and are CSAs would probably agree with me about that. There isn't anything there to help, so I wanted to try to help. The second reason was I felt I had a duty to share some of my experiences at least. And the third reason was that I felt I had something to say because actually in the times I spent as a Chief Scientific Advisor, I think I learned a lot. I certainly felt that I was on a learning curve the whole time. And even after I left, I felt I was still going up the learning curve because I was having a process of reflection back into all the experiences and beginning to understand a little bit about actually what was going on, because when you see it from a distance, you get a different perspective on it. So I had these three fundamental reasons for wanting to write the book. The book is structured in three sections. The first one, part one, I call a troubled marriage. And that really is a reflection on what I think the state of the system is now. And actually, I don't think there's any real news in that. It's obviously my interpretation of the challenges that exist for marrying science with both politics and policy. And I do distinguish between the two. Politics is really about the values-based discussion and debate that goes on about how to make collective decisions, and policy is about how you take the results of that and turn that into action. And I think one of the problems that we have is that science is generally not involved early enough in those discussions. And one of the reasons for it is that I think science itself has excluded itself actively, proactively excluded itself from those discussions, which you could call politics. Of course, politics is a very broad term. We often interpret it as being the high politics that happens in Westminster and Whitehall, but actually we're all involved in politics all the time. We're all negotiating our way through our existence. And what I mean by politics is that science has to be a part of that discussion, that debate that goes on. And if it's not, and if it comes too late to the discussion, then it actually is very limited in the influence it can bring. And I think that's the situation we're in at the moment. And within that section of the book, I refer to something called the scientifico-political predicament, which is really it's taken from Leo Strauss's view about the religio-political predicament when politicians rail against bishops when they speak out about political issues. But I think there's a similar thing for science, where as scientists, we probably have a duty to be involved in those debates, but by getting involved, we actually become corrupted. And I think that's one of the problems that we have to try to solve. We have to try to work that through. So I try to explain that within the book, and in doing so, I use a number of metaphors. And one metaphor, and maybe there are too many metaphors, and there's probably a mixture of metaphors, quite frankly, in the book, and I apologize for that. But I think metaphors can be quite powerful. So I talk about something called the politics factory. When we talk about politics, I think we often zero in on, as I said, what happens in Whitehall and Westminster. But actually, it's much wider than that. It's really about the wider diaspora of institutions and structures around it, NGOs, industry, lobby groups, all those kind of groups are all part of what I term the politics factory. And I just use that as a term because actually what it does is tend to manufacture the political process and often actually exaggerate difference when actually we've got quite a lot in common. and the other metaphor I have is a troubled marriage, and I think I would reflect on an article that actually Nature published in early December, which basically said that we as a scientific community see this as something that isn't working. And it's a bit like a troubled marriage, and that terminology is actually taken from a publication that was produced about 2003 or so. Part 2 is called Science Corrupted, and it's really about trying to take the consequences of the processes that science is involved in with respect to trying to get its voice heard, and understand what effect that has on science. So it's the scientifico-political predicament being played out. As I've been chair of the UK Research Integrity Office for the last 6 years, and I think a lot of the problems that sit with science integrity occur at that interface and are partly a result and partly driven by that interface process. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about that because it's actually it's something I think that if you're interested, you would need to read it in the book. But there are constructs like evidence, things like what works, experts, and normative research abound within this area, where there is lots of confirmation bias sitting in the research. Some people will say, well, that's actually the scientific community not doing its job properly. I think actually it occurs most in areas of post-normal science where there's high uncertainty, high demand for results, and a lot of controversy. As a result of that, I think that there are a number of mechanisms that happen which effectively degrade the quality of the science that actually goes into government. And a lot of these sort of constructs, particularly the construct of evidence, I think when it's applied within government, it's actually a social construct rather than one that comes from objective scientific investigation. The third part is something I call taming the beast, and it tries to be a bit more optimistic, because actually some of the earlier parts are pretty grim, actually, really. And this is about how we might be able to fix the problem. And I talk about trying to use scientific paradigms as narratives that can help get policy into the right framing context. And one of the paradigms is the epidemiological paradigm that I talk about, where just by setting up the particular paradigm, it helps the policymakers frame their questions in the right sort of ways. And there are lots of other paradigms like that. And I think we can be much clearer about the paradigms that we produce. I also think we can classify the kind of problems that government has to deal with in such a way that science can actually chew on it. And we also need to know quite a lot more about how science itself works to solve these problems. Finally, I come to what I think could be a structural solution to this. And I think this is a point really for debate. And actually, there's 70,000 words of preamble to this. And in the reviews so far, most reviewers have zeroed in on this on 2 or 3 pages where I've just described what I think could be a solution. And that is broadly based around the fact that I think that we need some form of process that's external to, let's say, the executive and legislative and judiciary structure within government that looks in on how science is used in order to be able to, if you like, kind of mark its homework to some extent. Because otherwise, I think they will get a continuous degradation of quality within the science that's used in that context. So just to finish off, I think that there are there are a number of conclusions I come to here, and one I think is that I don't think it's feasible to keep going in the direction we're going. I think we do need to make a change to this. I think that what's happening in the US at the moment with the new administration is a good illustration of the political weakness that science has within Western democracies. I think the scientific community itself, and actually I really don't spare the scientific community from criticism here. I think the scientific community itself has set itself up to be a bit of a scapegoat, and I think that needs to change. So the scientific community needs to be part of trying to develop better structures. And I think there are ways of achieving this, but it will need a lot of hard work and determination, particularly from the scientific community and the leaders within the scientific community to make that work. And at the moment, I'm not quite sure we have that capability within the science community. It's not been a traditional way that the scientific community has worked. So they're the kind of high-level messages that I wanted to try and give in the book. And with that, I'm going to stop. I see my interrogators are colluding to try and find a decent question. But once again, I'm really, actually, I'm touched by the fact that many of you have come along to listen to me this evening. But once again, I would ask, why have none of you written the book? And am I the idiot? Am I the idiot who actually stood up and did it? Thank you very much.
I think you're in the middle here. Gosh.
Helen, you.
Thank you. I wanted to start actually with the clash of cultures. I suppose, and I'm sure there are some people in this room who had this same experience, or just about as old as I am. I read your early introduction, your early chapters. Basically, as you say, it's pretty dark. Yeah. It's still pretty dark. And when you're discussing the clash of cultures, you describe, I think, essentially ministers and civil servants, we're all from the humanities, we're lawyers who see everything in black and white. We really don't get it. CP Snow is alive and well. I then look back at my experience, and my early experience of working in government with scientists, and this I hasten to add as a civil servant through and through in my core. This is not a political comment, but I was brought up in the old Department of the Environment, and my secretaries of state in succession were Michael Heseltine, Tom King, Chris Patton, John Gummer. And they were dealing with a lot of very tricky scientific issues, the ozone layer, for example, and the early days of GM. And I just don't recognize, or I only recognize partially, the description that you give. So I was going to encourage you to raise everyone's spirits to start off with by saying, there must be some examples you've got in your head of when it's worked really well, and what were the features of those which we might try and replicate?
Yes, there are, but I think it, and I think as you've suggested, I think it depends hugely on the quality of the politician that you're dealing with. And
it's not a political comment.
No. I mean, it really does, and maybe I was just unlucky in that what I experienced was. Very variable quality in the politicians that particularly at Secretary of State level, that I had to deal with. But I also think that there was at least one, and I will name him. Actually, I think Michael Gove was really fantastic in terms of his intellectual engagement. And I think the examples you've given are of people who are of equivalent intellectual stature. So there's no doubt whatsoever that the intellectual capabilities of the Secretary of State is really important. But I think I probably lived through a time which it was a bad batch, is the way I would probably put it. The kind of way that I kind of tried to articulate it in my own mind to rationalise this was that somebody like you, as the permanent secretary, or Claire, who was my line manager at the time, and I see is sitting in front of me, and thank you for coming. You know, after a cabinet reshuffle, sort of got a call from the Prime Minister and was told, go out into the street, and the first person you meet is going to be the new Secretary of State. And that was kind of the sort of quality that you kind of get. It's quite random. Yeah. Because actually the political process values skills that are not necessarily the skills about how to run a large organization. And the problem is that some of the Secretaries of States that I saw really didn't understand that it wasn't them who was there to run the large organization. It was people like you and Claire who were there to do it. And they tried to do that, and it wasn't very helpful. Yeah. But you know, there were good times, but there weren't many.
There weren't many. Okay. I was trying to do a sort of Pollyanna, let's keep our spirits up, as my friends in the audience will know. I think we might come back later. I'm sure someone will ask this question about, but in the end, you know, it's democracy in it. But, you know, I won't ask that question. I loved lots of things in the book, having got over my pessimism at the beginning. I loved the way you, your typology for different forms of problem and so on. I particularly loved the way you focused on systems, that we should look at scientific issues on a systemic basis rather than on a, I don't know what the other word is, topical basis, badgers through which many of us in this room have lived over the years, being the perfect example of you need to look at the whole food farming system. But when I got to the end, the famous thing that everybody is quoting, and your proposal for setting up a sort of OBR on science, that wouldn't solve the problem of how, right at the beginning of a good policy-making process, you define what the problem is you're trying to solve. And as all policymakers in the audience know, the big mistake ministers make is you haven't properly defined the problem you're trying to solve. So could you talk a bit about how OBR, yes, it can do a kite mark, but how do you actually get at the beginning of the policy-making process so that you do look at the system?
So you know, I wouldn't say that the equivalent of the Office of Budget Responsibility or Office of National Statistics is the whole answer by any means. You know, I think this is talking about systemic problems. This is about how science as a system interacts with another system. And you know, you can have you can have a number of different tools to do that, and the kind of OBR equivalence is one of the tools. I think there are other tools, and I do allude to this in the book, that you know, I think that the leadership within the scientific community has to be much more attuned to providing or making sure that science gets in to the system at a much earlier stage than it tends to do. As I say in the book, it's sort of, you know, it's the emergency response to the car crash a lot of the time. And it really can't be. It needs to be involved in designing the car and the road system and all the other things that go on. And often it isn't. And I'll give you an example of that. You know, I think the Common Agricultural Policy was fundamentally an unimplementable policy because it was invented in a purely policy environment, and the policy people then took it and said to the scientists, this is what we need you to measure, and at the end of the day we just couldn't measure it, you know, and we couldn't measure it with the accuracy that was required, and as a result, you know, it didn't really work very well, and still doesn't really work very well, and B, the UK got fined tens of millions of pounds a year for not providing the data properly. But you know, we actually, it was unmeasurable with the methods that were available. And you know, I think if science had been involved in something like that at a much earlier stage, it could have been shifted quite significantly to being something that was actually properly implementable. So it's about science managing to get itself into a position of strategic rather than tactical advice.
Yeah.
And how do we do that is the question. And I don't have the full answer to that, but at the moment, my feeling is that science is largely seen as a tactical advisory system that comes into play after a lot of the policy stuff has been done. Maybe it's a matter of having science advisors within political parties when they're actually coming up with their manifestos, that sort of thing. But that's what I mean by, we need to think broadly about the mechanisms around trying to make that happen a lot better. But I fully agree that I wouldn't use a kite mark, but something that helps us to maintain quality standards when science is used within government is only one part of the whole process.
Thank you.
So in the final section where you sort of explore things that might help mend the troubled marriage, you talk about how we as scientists are poor at communicating, and you talk about the importance of developing narratives and what you term the paradigm shift. Yeah. Might you expand a bit more on that?
Well, yes. I think that as scientists, we talk about paradigms quite a lot, or we've been used to operating within scientific paradigms, and of course, there's a deep philosophical history to that about how science works as a social process, and within science we build our paradigms and then we decide that they're not right and we move them on. I think those paradigms can actually help us develop the narratives. The problem, and I do say this in the book, is that paradigms can, if they're then translated into a policy context, they can become baked into the system. And then shifting, when the science moves on, the policy doesn't move on with it. And I use John Beddington will be aware of this maximum sustainable yield in fisheries as a scientific paradigm that is used right the way throughout the global fisheries management system. But is it really the right way to manage fisheries? And I would say, actually, we need to move on from it, because I think there are other ways of doing that. But unbaking that pie that's already been baked within the global fisheries management system is extraordinarily difficult. So one has to be really careful about paradigms. But at the same time, going to your point about narratives, I think that a lot of the people who are listening to science are much more capable of keying into a narrative rather than into detailed scientific argument. And paradigms give us a capability of talking about, a storyline about how things will play out. And the epidemiological paradigm is one. We've seen it through COVID-19. People experience what science is saying through actual action. And if you depart from those paradigms, then there are certain things that are going to happen, and they're relatively predictable. But it's a framework within which policy can actually operate, basically.
It always strikes me that when a CSA is appointed, it must be like landing on a new planet for the first time. What should we, in the university sector, in the broader research sector, what should we be doing with our young and middle career staff to perhaps make it easier for them to, initially apply for and then take on successfully a job? And I guess a corollary to that is, what do you know now that you wish you knew on that day that you walked into Nobel House, as it was then?
Oh gosh. Well,
walked in with an enormous amount of missionary zeal. I think that comes out very strongly.
Well,
yes.
Absolutely, yes.
You're going to grapple with this place.
I think there are two parts to that question. Well, how would we teach the upcoming generation? Well, I think that. I would say this. I think that the experiences that people like you and I, but many in this room, have. We do need to be able to relate those experiences to new generations coming through, and they are not. One of the reasons I wrote the book was because I think a lot of the the work that had been done on this sort of area had been done by social scientists. And a lot of it is very good. But actually, when I read that and compared it with my own experience, I thought, it's not really like that. You know, it's very personalized. And, you know, being able to transmit that to the people coming through, in that you can't, it's hard to systematize the relationship between a CSA and a Secretary of State, for example, or another minister. And I think under those circumstances, helping people through worked examples about how things played out is really important. So I think we could teach that better, is the way I would put it. What would I have wanted to know when I walked in, and I learned subsequently? I think I would have wanted to know I would have preferred to have had a better view on how to deal with the badger culling situation, quite frankly. But it's a wonderful example, and it's still ongoing. You know, it's one of these things that just rolls on and on and on. And Gideon's there. Gideon will be dealing with it right now, you know, and John is here, and John dealt with it a lot. It will go on and on and on. I don't think there is no one solution to it. But I wish I'd known a lot more about the technical details when I walked in.
Can I just add, I mean, what you say about understanding how to influence. First of all, big plug. The Royal Society actually has a scheme for early career researchers, which I chair with some people in this room doing the selection for. Yeah. I mean, whether 9 months gives you enough experience to then move on to be a CSA, I don't know. But what you describe, I think many civil servants here would recognise. This thing about understanding your minister, even if they change every 5 minutes, and knowing what drives them intellectually, what's their politics, who are their mates. It's much more important than the politics of the thing. Absolutely. And I think, in a sense, the training for the scientist should be exactly the same as the training for the generalist or policy-making civil servant. Perhaps doing this training together might be a great assistance.
I think it does. It is. You know, the thing is that the political system works fundamentally on personal relationships. You know, that's what drives it. And yet, as scientists, we want to bring total objectivity, take the subjectivity out of it, bring total objectivity to the problem. And actually, that doesn't work. You know, and I think you need to. The biggest challenge as somebody coming in as a scientist who's spent most of their career as a researcher is to understand that actually it's about personal relationships, really. And if you can get the trust of individuals within the system, and that includes senior civil servants, but it's also actually junior and middle ranking civil servants are really important too. You know, the whole system, but including ministers is so important. And just sort of banging the desk and saying that, well, this doesn't fit with scientific protocol. It doesn't really work. And a Hilary Benn is very different from a David Miliband. Absolutely. And you have to understand that. Exactly. Yeah.
So, as Ian has said several times, we have an extremely distinguished couple of front rows of people who've had much experience in this world. And so we're going to go for some questions first from them. And please, if you could just say who you are and very briefly your background. And then we'll go to the general audience. And just to warn you, we are live streaming this. So before you mention a particular minister or something like that, you might just want to bear that in mind. Who would like to go first? Claire. Sorry.
There are two Claires. Two Claires, you did one right. Okay. So I'm Claire Moriarty. I was the permanent secretary in Defra for part of Ian's time there, and so many of the things you're talking about resonate very much. But I suppose I wanted to start. I think this thing about starting young is really important. Yeah. As I started out in the Department of Health, and one of the most seminal roles I had was working on drug misuse. when I worked very closely with a clinical academic, and he introduced me to his mates who were also clinical academics, and I became interested in their research. In those days, government departments had, we had research departments. We commissioned original research. We had in the Department of Health, we had a Director General for research. And I used to sit on the number 63 bus every morning reading research and then asking questions. And I think that kind of the early immersion of civil servants in a world of research and the expectation that you actually need to bridge, it is the bridging of the two perspectives, which feels really, really important. And then on the other side, as you say, early career researchers, and I think one of the things that Ian did very successfully in Defra was to bring together young policy people and early career researchers and actually have the discussions about the policy, because that is exactly as Helen says, the thing that doesn't happen in government is what somebody memorably called "let the dog see the rabbit." So government departments are constitutionally inclined to create solutions and then say to scientists, can you kind of double check the solution and making sure it's all right, and you never get the best result. And actually finding the confidence to go back a stage and say, let's have a conversation, let's share our policy problems with scientists, with people who can just bring a different perspective. That is the way, and that introduced people, it created space where people could form those relationships. Now, I guess it's quite interesting. Some of that is modern and some of that is historic. And I suppose, the question in it is, what's the way? How does more of that get built in? Because it doesn't address the political problem, which I completely, and the politicians' problem, which I recognise. But the more that the civil service is really, really deeply rooted in science, the more likely that is that's the sea that the politicians are then swimming in.
Yeah. So, Claire, it's wonderful to see you again after a number of years. And thank you for all the support you gave me while I was in Defra, actually. But if I can give an illustration of where I think some of the problems lie, I think it was during your tenure when we produced the farming strategy. I can't remember what it was called now. It was a document about the future of farming, and the civil service there did a fantastic job of producing an evidence annex to it. But when you actually read the strategy, the policy strategy document, there was no mapping whatsoever from the evidence to the policy document. And I think that illustrates actually your point very well, in that I think the civil service actually does, in general, not always, but in general, does a very, very good job. But actually, we're not levering the expertise that sits within the civil service into the policy domain in such a way that it really is going to make a difference, particularly within the context of evidence gathering and evidence expression. So, that was something that was. I remember reading the strategy document and just thinking, this is a completely wasted opportunity. We had this fantastic evidence annex, which actually had taken a long time to produce and was the best compendium of what the UK's farming, particularly the English farming system, but the UK's farming system overall was like, and where the challenges lay. And it seemed as if the policy document had not even read it, to be quite frank. So I mean, what am I saying here? I think the dissonance happens at the political level, and so my feeling is that in order to address that dissonance, science has to be much more active at that political level. But how to make that happen is really, really, really hard.
So I'm going to pass to the second Claire, and then Jim and Fiona afterwards.
Thank you very much. I'm Claire Craig. Amongst other things, I was director of the Government Office for Science and worked with a number of people here, including Ian, and I'm forever grateful to John Beddington, who's behind me, for recruiting me to that post. But you mentioned that evidence is a social construct, and in your book, you talk about some of the challenges of presenting scientific evidence alongside other forms of evidence, some of which may be quite heuristically sound, say coming from expert patient groups or indigenous groups. and yet you say that they're different from science because the underlying causes may not be known.
Yeah.
And that seems to me to be an increasing challenge also with forms of evidence coming from AI and the way that AI surveys different types of data. I wondered if you could say a little more about what you think might be the best ways of enabling good consumption of scientific evidence and acknowledging what's good about these other sources, but not getting distracted. And you use the word hocus pocus, I think, quite a lot as well.
I do use
yes,
charlatans and hocus pocus.
Avoiding the hocus pocus.
Yes, maybe a bit too much. Claire, again, it's wonderful to see you again. And actually, I've learnt quite heavily in the book on some of the work you've done on developing narratives and that sort of thing. So thank you for that. I've lost the thread of what you asked. Sorry.
Other forms of knowledge.
Other forms of knowledge. Yes,
contexts.
Absolutely. Yes. So I suppose I worry to some extent about the extent to which there is compromise on the quality of scientific knowledge and argument, and I think one of the problems is, in let's say in the biodiversity and environmental space, indigenous knowledge is something that is really very popular at the moment, and I think that one has to acknowledge that some, let's say, indigenous peoples do know a lot about their environment and actually can bring an immense amount of information to bear on it. But some of it is hocus pocus. And we need to know the difference, and we need to be able to identify the difference. And it's the same within any socially developed process for understanding how the world around us works. Some of it will be built on true empirical, if you like, almost experimental knowledge from trying something and something works or doesn't work and that sort of thing. But a lot of it won't be. A lot of it will be around belief systems and these sorts of things. Some of them may actually reflect how the system really does work. But the question I think I always found with dealing with these sort of things in the context of what evidence to take from the wider diaspora of evidence and actually say this is reliable evidence, you can use this in a policy context, was to identify the good stuff from the bad stuff, or the reliable stuff from the unreliable stuff. And there's an awful lot of evidence that sits around there which is, it's masquerading, is the way I would put it, as high quality when it's actually quite low quality. And it's really hard when you're in that position of having to advise a minister, well, use this evidence or that evidence to know what is good and what is bad. In the end, you often have to make a judgment about, well, where does it come from? Is it a reliable source? Those sorts of things. Or, looking at a scientific paper and understanding, particularly the methods. Are the other methods reliable or not? But even that actually sometimes masquerades as high quality when it's actually quite low quality. So anyway.
Okay, just move on because we've got quite a few questions. It's Jim, Fiona, then Gideon.
Hi Ian. Hi. My name is Jim Naismith. I'm a former colleague of Ian from St Andrews. I'm now head of MPLS in Oxford. So Ian, I was going to talk a little bit about science. And I think there is a problem in our community, because defining even the science community is a problem. So any politician can find some crank fringe, somebody with professor in front of their name to say exactly what they want, or they'll get a microphone and TV, and nothing is really easily done about that. The Science Media Centre's policy of all voices probably was quite effective during COVID, but my parents left school at 16 as the family. They were terrified by even who we would think of as mainstream scientists going on and shroud waving irresponsibly on TV.
Yeah.
The second problem I have is even mainstream scientists with mainstream views using science to wage political fights by another means.
Yeah.
The question that we don't ask ourselves often enough It's why a plurality of voters in the US, a significant minority in this country, and possibly growing, have decided that it is politically advantageous to run against science as a concept. And I think we, as scientists, have lost our way a little bit in that we don't tell politicians or give advice. We've started to think we should tell people what they have to do, and they didn't vote for rule of experts, in my view.
I mean, just responding to that, you know, I agree, Jim, with what you say. You know, I think the scientific community needs to change its practices. I think there's no doubt about that. And that what I think we do need an authentication process to be able to identify people who are more reliable and those who are less reliable. And that's why, you know, at the end of the book, I think that, you know, I come to this conclusion that not only do we need, let's say, an authority, or let's call it an authority, and I don't know what shape that would be, that is able to challenge I'll say the political system overall about how science is used. I think we need that authority to be able to say this person is reliable and this person isn't reliable. Now, we already have that to some extent within the system, but we don't use it very much. You know, I'm president of the Royal Society of Biology. It has an authentication process. I don't even use it. Maybe I should. Royal Society of Chemistry does the same. Institute of Physics does the same. We could use it a lot more than we do, but we don't. And my view is that we do need to use it a lot more.
Thank you. Fiona, then Gideon, then Peter, then Bernard.
Yeah, Fiona Fox from the Science Media Centre. I was just going to follow on from Jim and say, how do we then kind of simultaneously encourage scientists to engage with politics and policy, which your book is asking us to do, and discourage those scientists from crossing the line into becoming lobbyists and campaigners? But since that's already been slightly addressed, one more cheeky one. I just always get the impression that within weeks of becoming a chief scientific advisor, you get cross with the rest of us for not, you know, for the scientific community, for almost willfully misunderstanding the policy process. Is that fair? And should scientists be expected, should academic scientists be expected to understand the policy process and understand what hell you are all clearly going through?
Yeah. No, I mean, I think that if you're an academic scientist and if you're just doing your research and aren't interested in it, that I don't think there's a need for you to understand the policy process. But I think if you are an academic scientist and you are involved in, if you like, the areas of science that you would generally call post-normal and are highly controversial and are one of those who stands up and gives public comment, I think you're duty bound to know a lot more about the policy process and to understand it a lot better. And to go to some of Helen's points earlier on, you know, I have, and I do say this in the book, I have huge sympathy for people in ministerial positions because they are presented with some unbelievable dilemmas. And you know, you sit in the room with them and there's just no good outcome, there's no good decision here. And it's about trying to help them through that. And I think sometimes within the scientific community there isn't enough empathy about those really difficult moments. And I think if it comes back from CSAs that there's frustration, it's partly because actually somebody is really just being a bit of an arse, to be honest.
Thank you. Gideon.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. I'm Gideon Henderson. I stepped into Ian's very big shoes and took over the role as CSA at Defra after him. I've got 2 quick plugs and 2 quick questions. I will be quick, I promise you, Charles. The plugs, first of all, we run now an R&D fellowship scheme in Defra. We've got about 60 fresh graduate students after their PhDs working in Defra, trying to learn more about that policy science interface. And I definitely recognise what others have said about the need to get people experienced in that interface earlier in their careers. That's one plug for Defra thing. The other plug is Sense About Science, not anything to do with Defra. They have run a program about transparency of evidence. which I think has been very effective, and it sort of critiques government in a way rather similar to your OBR-like body, a science body might do. I think that's an example of a rather small NGO doing some of the things that you might be recommending. It's done some really good stuff. And my first question then is, there's obviously a need not only for external challenge, but for good scientists inside government. Some other countries do that much more. Singapore being a good case in point, China, there's other countries. Do you think your book is really a critique of the UK system, or is it a critique more generally of systems? And then my second question, which is somewhat related, is, I want to know this, how corrupt am I? And other people inside government, how corrupt are we? Because you talk about the fact that if you work inside government, you get corrupted by the process. What do you mean by that? What's the nature of the corruption?
Yeah, I mean, corrupt is a strong word. Let me go to your first question. Clearly, this is quite UK orientated, but I do try to generalize it as much as possible. I mean, I think the UK overall does a relatively good job, but overall, I think a bad job is being done on a global scale. So, you know, we're not very far up the spectrum of getting these things done well. And yes, I mean, I think that we need to integrate, you know, scientists within the policy community, and other nations are beginning to do that, and perhaps some of them are doing it a bit better than us. The more that we can get into the policy community, the better. Yes, I mean, the word corruption is a strong word, but I mean, I don't know what you felt, Gideon, but I felt, you know, a lot of the time that my standards were being stretched, you know, to some extent, and it took quite a lot of will, self-discipline, to make sure that the basic scientific standards that I had been, you know, taught and had practiced for a very long time were sustained and maintained. And when I say corruption, I mean that sometimes, actually a lot of the time, I think that many scientists who get involved, less so on the CSA side of things, because I think a lot of individuals like you and me and others, and I see Paul in front of me, are wise to this, but people who get involved who are not so wise to it can actually fall into a trap, which is basically to produce what I would call normative science, which is really a science that is helping to drive the policy in a particular direction. And that's what I really mean by corruption. I don't really mean individuals really are making an overt decision to undermine science. I think that there is an invidious underlying process that draws them in order to be able to produce the results that somebody else wants, rather than the results that actually really are needed. So that's what I mean by it. So it's not a personalized criticism.
So I'm going to take a few more questions from the people in the front. So I've got Peter, then Bernard, then Christon. If you could be quite brief, because I then want to go to the general audience. Peter.
Thanks very much, Charles. Peter Bruce, Professor of Materials, but perhaps more relevant to this discussion. I spent 5 years as physical secretary at the Royal Society, so I spent a lot of time interacting with policymakers and politicians, and it's a great pleasure to see you again, Ian, my second ex-St Andrews colleagues. When are you coming to join us is my first question, I guess. I suppose what I'm going to say, and you may think this is unfair, and I'm sure you'll tell me if you think so. A lot of what you said, and many of the comments of others, seem to presuppose that you're going to have to communicate science as an advisor to those receiving advice who are scientifically illiterate. And is that not really the elephant in the room? Will we ever get that communication right until we have a level of scientific literacy from the receiver? And I think what struck me was some of my friends and colleagues in Germany, and this is when sort of COVID times, even though Angela Merkel came from a very different part of the scientific endeavor, they found that communicating these issues, particularly things like statistics, to Merkel was much easier than I think were perhaps true in our case. So it perhaps follows on a bit from Gideon's question. Did you look at other countries, and there are relatively rare examples, as we know, where there are actually scientifically literate people in senior leadership positions in politics? And does that system work better when that's the case? So it's just how important is that issue of scientific literacy on the other side of the...
Well, I mean, I think it's very important. You know, I think that if people have been trained in science, then I think they're always going to have a capacity, intellectual capacity, to absorb the information that is coming from science in a better way. You know, your direct question, did I look at it? I suppose I've looked at it generally overall, but you know, I am focusing mainly on the UK system, and you know, at some point, I think it's in the appendices actually. You know, I do a sort of analysis of the number of people who were at the time I was a CSA in government who had a scientific training, and there were very, very few. I can't remember the numbers, but it's really, really small. So you know, the more we can help with that, the better. But you know, we have to work with the materials that we have, and you know, I think as science advisors, and I don't say chief scientists, I think this is all scientists who are working at that interface. We need to learn to construct the narratives, as we said earlier on, in such a way that people can actually understand them, first of all, and pick them up and apply them. And I think that we in the science community are, in general, not very good at that. It's a difficult thing to do. You know, one of the things that Claire might remember is that I wanted to produce evidence statements within Defra about, you know, key areas of policy, and these evidence statements would be no more than 2 sides of A4 that a minister could read in 5 or 10 minutes, that would give him or her all the information they needed on a quite a complicated scientific subject in order to be able to ensure that they were at a slightly higher level than they would be otherwise. These were, I mean, some of them were okay, but they were enormously difficult to produce. And not just to produce, but to keep up to date, you know. So there's no really simple solution to that, but I think that it's about these personal relationships, about having empathy with the listener and trying to construct the response to the listener in such a way that they are able to understand it.
Hello, I'm Bernard Salzman. I was the Home Office's Chief Scientific Advisor. My permanent secretary is sitting there, and Ian and I overlapped for 5 years, actually, of your 7 years and mine. I left a little bit before you. I will remind you, Ian, that Ian was one of my best friends, and I hope that was reciprocated. And we used to have dinner together and things like that. And Ian once said, you know, I spent 3 hours today explaining in detail a scientific concept to the Secretary of State, and it was really good. He was really interested in it, really good. And it's someone whose career came to a very bad end indeed. And yet I just wonder whether you're looking at the past through the opposite of rose-tinted spectacles. But that's not the question. The question is, and similarly, actually, on international comparisons, my counterpart in America at Homeland Security thought the British system was just wonderful. And so I'm not sure whether, again, it's not bad that one should have a critique. I haven't read your book, I've only listened. Now, don't you think the learned societies and national academies could play a better part and be this authority that you're talking about? I thought that's what Peter was going to talk about, and I've got several Royal Society people around me here, but don't you think that's what national academies ought to be doing?
Thank you.
Yes, in short. I have no doubt about that. And I think there's a question about how the national academies could work better together. And I will speak as the president of the Royal Society of Biology. I think Royal Society of Biology works pretty well with the Royal Society of Chemistry and the Institute of Physics. The problem is the Royal Society, actually, and I'm saying that in a public domain, where you have the premier organisation which has the capacity to really knock on the highest political door in the country, and it does need to do more of a coordinating activity. I have no doubt about that at all, but it doesn't. And I'll leave it at that, Bernard. And I see you nodding. Yes.
Thank you. So the last question from Crystal, and then the general audience, please wave at me so I can see you. Crystal.
Hi, Crystal Donnelly, professor here in Oxford, where I work on infectious diseases, including bovine, TB, and badgers.
Yes.
But also recently vice president of the Royal Statistical Society for External Affairs. And one of the things I was wondering about, you mentioned sort of giving a certification as a society. So from the Royal Statistical Society, we have chartered statisticians. Yeah. And I think that's great for a certain purpose. But I would be really scared if that was somehow used as, so you will always say sensible things.
Yeah, yeah.
Because I think people with, that I can't see other than extended experience that someone is measured and thoughtful and thinks before they speak. It's really hard to see how that could work, whatever the society was.
So I completely agree. Although I think that, I think there has to be, not has to be, but I think that science would do well to look at some of the other professions and how they manage quality control within those professions. I think the scientific community could come up with a system. It would be different from those ones. It would be tailored to the needs of the scientific community. But nevertheless, my personal view is that it's needed. Royal Society of Biology does chartered biologist and those sorts of things, same sort of thing. But the rate of uptake from within the science community is very, very low. I think if it was valued more, perhaps even by the policy profession, then it would be the rate of uptake would be higher. But I think that for any authentication process like that, it's got to be able to be given, but also withdrawn as well. If it's just given and it just rolls on and on and on, it's really not worth the paper it's written on. I think we do need a sort of not just slightly, a much harder nosed process with respect to that. But I agree with you, there are pitfalls and dangers with it. But we're not dealing with a perfect system. There's going to be imperfections in it.
Thank you. Lady just behind.
Hi. My name's Helen Bennett, and I used to be a government lawyer. And actually, Helen, you were one of my very, very first clients in Defra. I don't know if you recall me, but together...
See you again.
We took all sorts of interesting legislation through. Congratulations on becoming a PermSec.
Thank you.
I think that the problem actually goes much further back. And I'm sorry, was it Philip in front of me? Peter, I'm so sorry. I think what we actually need are not more scientific advisors, but simply more people generally with a solid understanding of science. So you don't become a research scientist and then end up as a government advisor. You simply have a science background and go into the civil service as a policy civil servant. And when Helen and I were sort of battling together with rate capping and stuff, it was wonderful. And that was the stage at which an awful lot of ministers and, in fact, policy civil servants had to very rapidly acquire some legal skills. And I ended up at the Civil Service College running legal awareness courses for young policy civil servants, and I like to think it helped. I do think that it's harder to get science into people's educational curriculums, largely because of the class bias against it in England, I'm afraid. And I do mean England. I mean, I think it's very different in Scotland. But I think long-term, we've just got to get more people into the civil service at every level.
Thank you.
With a STEM background.
Well, I mean, I agree. You know, I can't say anything other than that. I think there's huge awareness of the lack of, let's say, I'll say graduates at all levels of education in STEM, and we do need that to be filtered right the way through society, much more than we have. And I think the civil service, but also politics, you know, it really needs that. I suspect in the UK we're not as good as many other countries on that, which is unfortunate.
I should say, Michael Heseltine wanted more scientists in the civil service because he said they were more decisive, quote. I've tested that over the years as a concept.
Question here. Please wave them if you want to ask a question so I can set them up. But gentleman in the green jersey.
Hi, Brockberg Seth. I'm a visiting fellow at the Interdisciplinary Center for Conservation Science. I do a lot of behavior change and look at how we influence behavior. What it strikes me as when you spoke about politics is about personal relationships. In a previous life, I worked as a funder, and I understood how many kind of influential moments happened in side corridors, over coffee, at dinner, at the pub. As scientists, I think there's a huge power disparity between institutions and that of scientific institutions in our ability to, you know, do those types of things. So often it comes on me to spend out of my own pocket to go and try to buy a politician or a policymaker a coffee. How do you think institutions can do something about that? And then the second kind of follow-on with that, same issue. I don't know if you paid attention to the news, but has anyone heard of Vfluence? Vfluence was just shut down in the United States, run by the former executive head of relations from Monsanto. They were doing psychographic profiling and building a bunch of derogatory information on people that were pesticide critics. You know, as scientists...
I'm probably one of them.
Yeah, as scientists, how do we protect ourselves and how do our institutions protect us for essentially the fact that people are willing to play underhand, dirty tactics?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, to your second question, I can't answer that right now. You know, first of all, I think that somebody working on behavior change is really important because actually, you know, I think that we do need to drive significant behavior change across society for all sorts of different reasons. But, you know, I'm an environmental scientist. I see the environmental problems that there are, which drive a lot of the health problems, etc. And we do need people like you to do work on that. But, you know, let's face it, there are huge problems or challenges around people collecting behavioral data and the way that particularly social media can be used and manipulated to drive behaviors. And one of the things that I think the scientific community overall has not done terribly well is understood the products of its own creation, which are things like the advertising process. You know, advertisers are just really, really good at driving behavior change. You know, they earn a huge amount of money out of it. We don't turn in our knowledge of these sort of things into our own activities and help people understand what science brings to them in terms of the advantages in their lives. And we're really, really bad at that. So that's not an answer to your question about how do you combat the underhand processes. But I do think that science needs to use its own knowledge to talk about itself, and it tends not to do that. But you know, there's a further discussion to be had about how we stop some of those processes that are really negative, and AI is going to add to those challenges.
Thank you. There was a question at the back, and I've just lost the hand that went up. Perhaps it's gone away. Let's take that question there.
Hello, I'm a first-year DPhil student in the oncology department here. I'm hoping this question's in your wheelhouse, but so I'm really, really passionate about research translation to the clinic and getting new drugs and mainly in the cancer research and biology fields, it's a protein that can be used as a drug target or as a biomarker into the clinic in the long term. And I often find there's a big gap between the world of science and the real world, in that so few, every scientific paper, for example, in cancer research, ends with, and this protein could be used as a biomarker or a drug target, but so few of them get to the clinic. And there is such a lack of willingness in the world of science to really drive stuff to the clinic. Do you agree that that needs to change, and there needs to be more of a focus in terms of policy from the government to try and encourage more scientists to bridge that gap? Because it takes a lot of effort to get something to the clinic, like a spin-out company or collaboration. And how do you think we could encourage that to occur to a greater extent?
I think that there's a whole other discussion to be had about how we take scientific invention and translate it into a societal outcome. I do talk in the book about the difference between private good and public good in the scientific activities we undertake. And my feeling is that we need to understand, as scientists, as research scientists, we need to understand better our own motivations. I think much of scientific research is driven by a fundamental, moral perspective, which is that this is trying to drive public good. But actually, a lot of it is then taken to drive private good. In other words, it's about driving markets, it's about creating economic outcomes, those sorts of things. And I think we need to be much more direct and honest with ourselves about why we are undertaking research. To your particular point about drugs and oncology, my suspicion is that it's not my field, but the vast majority of people who are involved in that are doing it because they think that actually they can produce a cure which is going to create huge public good out of it. I think in the majority of cases, it probably does a bit of that, but actually it's really probably driving a lot of private good because it's actually, the invention is taken and put into the capitalist system, and it drives a capitalist process. My view is that we as scientists have to be much more involved than we are at the moment about understanding, when that process is happening, and sometimes saying no. The original moral reason for doing this research was for public good, and it shouldn't go in the direction of developing profits for big corporates and that sort of thing.
So I'm afraid we've come to the end of our time, and I particularly apologise to the gentleman in front who actually had the microphone in his hand. Can I first thank all the questioners from the general audience and from the special guests. By chance, I happened to be in Defra the day that Ian's appointment was announced. And being the only I was with officials, and being the only biologist, I was asked, who is this guy? And I explained who he was and that he was director of the Sea Mammal Research Unit. And I remember a senior civil servant saying, well, at least he'll be fit for porpoise. And I think Ian has definitely, he also has a high cetacean count for those. So I think Ian has definitely demonstrated he's fit for the purpose. And on behalf of Helen and me, thank you so much for such a fascinating talk.
Thank you.
And please join us outside for a glass of wine and to chat to Ian more.